Good morning. My name's James Pinchbeck and I'm marketing partner with Streets Chartered Accountants. It is my pleasure on behalf of the firm and Best Start HR to welcome you to our annual payroll and HR update. Before we start, a little housekeeping, so to speak. This session is being recorded and will be shared with delegates and will be available online after the event. You'll also be able to download the slides at the end of the session, and these will be shared with delegates also. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please could we ask that you use the chat function to the right-hand side of your screen. What we propose to do is, where possible, the speakers will respond to the questions in the chat to the benefit of those asking the questions and the other delegates. But at the end of the sessions, we're very obviously time focused, and this is 11 till 12. If you have a question and are able to stay around for a few minutes afterwards, then we'll take the other questions at the end of the whole session. Joining us for the presentation today will be Teresa Waddingham, Senior Payroll Manager with Streets Chartered Accountants, and also Anita Wynne, who's a Director of Best Start HR. Teresa's presentation will focus on the forthcoming changes affecting payroll as we start the new year, along with some useful hints and tips to make your life easier to ensure those charged with payroll are on the right track. I seem to recollect in many other annual payroll updates, we've often talked about the things introduced in the year, whether it was auto-enrollment, RTI or GDPR. This last 12 months has been no exception, and I imagine many of you have been busy with CJRS and furlough, and perhaps even now considering the impact of IR35. Our second presenter, Anita Wynne, is well known to many of you who have attended our past payroll events. Anita always provides a thought-provoking presentation on some impact of employment and HR affecting clients and their businesses in the next 12 months. Anita's presentation will focus on the roadmap for return to business, understanding the lasting impact of the pandemic on the workforce, and looking at what employers and HR personnel need to consider and act upon as they get to grips with the new normal. Approach is not going to be as easy as a factory reset. It now gives me pleasure to pass over to Teresa for her presentation. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. Without any further ado, we've got quite a mix of material to come through today. So I'll just outline what we've got coming up first of all. So we're going to cover the changes of the legislation that have come through from April. We're going to have a brief look at correcting payroll errors and omissions, a look at the updated guidance on furlough, the furlough over under claims and how to treat them. I'm sure most of you will have been dealing with some of that. I'm going to touch on employing EU nationals and have a quick look at the impact of Brexit and the introduction to our payroll offering and the benefits of outsourcing, who we are and what we do. So to start with the legislation, hopefully you've all seen the minimum wage changes. The main thing to watch out for is this change to the age 23 and above. That can impact quite significantly on your salaried workers. You can see that when you do a calculation, you're looking at about 17,500 for a 23-year-old on minimum wage. So it's good housekeeping to look at all your salaries that you've got at the start of the year. Don't forget your ones that are on part-time hours, recalculate them out, just make sure that they're complying with those minimum wage numbers. Now, it's almost all workers are entitled to. There is a minimum wage calculator on the Revenue website if you're struggling. But you do need, if you do find any discrepancies, you do need to backdate and put them in the correct position. The minimum wage legislation is one of the harshest pieces of legislation. It was introduced to be a gentle legislation, but it has, in turn, the revenue do treat it quite fiercely, and their penalties are quite severe. So as you can see, the rates on the slides, they've all gone up, but obviously the top two, the most significant. Just bear in mind that if they're under school leaving age, which is actually a date in June when they actually fit, when they have the option to leave school, then the if they're under that, the minimum wage doesn't apply. But once they hit that school leaving age, then you are obliged to pay the minimum wage. If we have a brief look at the statutory rates, they've gone up slightly. We're looking at the £151.97 or the £96.35 for the SSP. Just bear in mind your small employers relief. You need to check that to make sure that you qualify before you tick the box and send that over. It does make a difference of the percentages of what you can claim, and can be quite significant if you have a number of people taking statutory benefits. Now, an interesting one that almost went under the radar is the student loan threshold. There's another one. So we now have Plan 1, 2 and 4 and a postgrad threshold. So the key on this is just to make sure that you get the up-to-date starter checklist. If you can't find it, let us know and we can email it to you. It does have all the tick boxes. Get your new starters to complete it, then they're responsible for giving you the information. If there's an issue with them being on the wrong plan, the revenue should be sending you a new update through your download. Make sure you've got them incorporated onto your online account. Now, just before we go on to gender pay gap, I'm just going to touch on the employment allowance. Again, this year, you do need to submit an EPS if you're going to claim it. It has to be applied for every year. And if you're doing past years, if you want any advice on that, do get in touch. It is a bit of a tricky one. You have to take the indicator off and submit before you put it back on again for each year. They don't carry forward anything historically. So just check that you're entitled to claim it. Just remember there is a 100,000 if you're over that, you're not able to claim. If it's your employer NI liability, and just check. There are one or two odd things relating to the claim with regards to state aid, which is received from the European Union if you've received anything. But it should state on what you've received whether it is state aid, but that does affect your employment allowance. There's been a bit of reprieve on the gender pay gap reporting. They have extended it because of COVID. They've allowed you to have until the 5th of October 2021 to report the information. It applies to employers over 250 employees. So if you fall into that, you have had a little bit of reprieve. Just remember that it will have to go through by the 5th of October 2021. The whole of 1920 was suspended, but now you do have to, will have to comply. And if you want to do it, if you've already done it for earlier, then that's absolutely fine. They haven't got a problem with that. Now, onto the off payroll working, I'm just going to very briefly touch on this. We have loads of information on this as a practice. If you feel that this is of interest to you, do let us know. We can send you the relevant webinar, the relevant podcast to update you on that. But just to reassure you, our payroll software will process deemed payments if it's applicable. It does need a different identifier on your FPS submission, and it doesn't include student loans, auto-enrolment, holiday schemes. Statutory payments are not part of a deemed calculation. Now, just before we go on to the payroll errors and omissions, I'm just going to touch briefly on the other bits that have come out regarding new employees. Kickstart scheme is a new, they've extended that. It's not new. They've extended it to include, it's for job placements for 16 to 24-year-olds. And it depends on the age of the participant, but it's national living wage for 25 hours per week for a total of 6 months. And it's an incentive scheme for you to employ. It's a grant, you have to apply for it, but it's an incentive for new employees. In addition, there's a apprentice incentive. If you are, there's an incentive payment of £3,000 for new apprentices employed from the 1st of April 21 until the 30th of September 21. So that's quite a nice incentive if you're thinking about taking on new staff. The government also announced in the budget free ports. There will be 8 in England. If you're interested in if they are relevant for you, then do get in touch. There are various things they're doing to support these free ports. National insurance contributions, rate relief for employer national insurance is one of the things that apply if you're taking on new employees. So if it affects you, it's one to look at. If you need further information, again, let us know and we can provide that for you. I'm just going to go on now just to correcting payroll errors and omissions. The revenue have changed this in so much as if any of you have had to do any of these previously, what you had to do was an early year update. And essentially, if you've got historical errors, you've already gone past the tax year that they relate to, you have to do what's known as an early year update. And it effectively, it adds or deducts funds out of the employee's account. Obviously, it has to be done with caution. It does affect all the NI bandings, so you do have to do a significant calculation for it. But the revenue have took this away this year, but they haven't done it historically. So prior years, you will still need to do an early year update if you've got amendments to do. But amendments relating to the tax year from the 5th of April 21 onwards can only be done with actually amending the FPS submission. So it's one to check on your payroll software just to make sure that your provider's up to speed with that, that you're able to amend the FPS submission and you're able to submit it. And just bear in mind that any amendments you do should show on your dashboard. I would highly recommend, if you're not registered already, that you register as an employer. It does give you lots of information about what you've submitted through your software. It should, in theory, link completely with the revenue, with what you've submitted through your software. It can have errors. It's not 100% all the time. So take a skeptical view of it. If it's something that doesn't look right at all, contact the revenue and just get them to check that what your dashboard's showing matches what you've done on your FPS submissions. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is those submissions do feed into an individual's personal tax account. So I can log into my personal tax account and I can see what was submitted for me last month through the payroll. And I can also see, for instance, anybody was on furlough. For payroll, this has not been an option, but if you did have any employees that were on furlough, they would also be able to see that as a separate item. The revenue have done something to their systems to make that visual, so an employee can check that what you've actually claimed matches what they've actually been given. So just one thing to bear in mind. And that brings us on to the updated furlough guidance. Now, the furlough guidance has been updated constantly by the revenue. There's 3 pages of dates of updates that they've done regarding this guidance, and they're still behind. There is more guidance due in before the 1st of May. For any of you that are doing furlough calculations, you'll probably realise that when you do the calculation, you're looking at prior periods. You're now in a situation where if you look for a whole year, you could have a whole year of furlough payments in that calculation. As of yet, we've had no guidance as to what they're going to do about that and what periods you're looking at to assess somebody's wages. Now, for salaried people, this is not so much of an issue. It's fairly straightforward. But when you're looking at the averaging, for hours, it can be quite complicated, especially if it crosses the calendar month time period. So please do keep an eye on that. The changes are constantly coming through. The grant level is going to change in July. As you can see on the table, 70%, so it needs employer contribution, and down to 60% in August and 60% in September. Whether that will be changed at some point, we don't know, but obviously it's ongoing at the moment. So just watch the caps, because they have to be prorated to the amount of claim. Now, there's something that came through yesterday that was new, that they popped through, the revenue popped through on an advice notification, that if your employee is furloughed, is effectively flexible furloughed, you can count all time taken as holiday as furloughed hours rather than working hours. So if you've got somebody on flexi furlough and they go on holiday, you are actually allowed to do that as furloughed hours, but just remember it's got to be topped up to their actual wages rather than just furlough. Holiday pay has to be topped up because it's a statutory obligation. The revenue have said that the daily maximum wage amounts on or after the 1st of May for the cap will be guidance will be updated in due course. So we're waiting on that. I'm expecting any day to have guidance on the furlough calculations. So we'll move on to under and over claims. So apologies if you haven't claimed any furlough and this is not relevant for you, but I know that we have lots of queries about this, so I did just want to cover a bit of it. It's important that the employees are paid the correct amount, because obviously they can then lodge a complaint against you if not. If you need to amend your claim, contact HMRC. let them know that you're increasing the amount of your claim. You only have 28 calendar days to amend. However, what I would say is that I have heard of situations where an employer's telephoned the furlough helpline and the revenue has put exceptional claims through. So if you think you're justified in your claim and the revenue won't let you do it online, do contact them. It's worth a shot. If you've claimed too much, you have to have a reference number to pay it back, basically. So you do have to contact the revenue to let them know. Now, if we have a look at the EU nationals now and what's happened with Brexit. So, first of all, if we look at employing EU citizens, there's no difference with your right to work checks. They haven't changed. So your right to work checks should apply to everyone, regardless of what nationality they are. You should be doing right to work checks on UK as well as overseas. Otherwise, you're effectively discriminating. So carry on your right to work checks as you are until the 30th of June 21, because that's when the points-based immigration system and the closing date for the EU settlement scheme. So the points-based system has various categories that you can apply through if it applies to you. If you need information on that, we can point you in the right direction. It's quite complicated, but there are various categories. You can get a temporary visa for 6 months for seasonal workers. There are various things to enable the EU citizens to work in the UK. The settlement scheme, if you've got employees that were living in the UK prior to 31st of December, then the deadline for the applications is the 30th of June 21. Really important for the employees to get those. There's no obligation for you as an employer. You're not obliged to force them down that route. They don't have to apply for the EU settlement scheme if they don't want to, but obviously it's in their interest. So it might be something that you're interested in to have a look at. I'll just briefly mention the national insurance. There is a reciprocal agreement. It is slightly different to what it was before, but there again, it's quite a complex area. The way it works is that you shouldn't pay national insurance in the EU and in the UK at the same time. And there are means, there's various certificates depending on the circumstances that you can apply for, which allows you not to have to pay the national insurance in whichever country that it applies to. It really does depend on where you're living and where you're working as to how that works. But there again, if you need more information on that, happy to provide it. So, benefits of outsourcing. Okay. Security, GDPR. How many times have we heard GDPR? However, the impact on a business can be quite horrendous. From an outsourcing point of view, as data processors, the important thing is that whoever you use to do your payroll, if you're thinking of outsourcing, that they have the means in place to make sure that the employee data is secure. And the employee data, personal data, is what makes them individual. Name, address, date of birth, NI number, employee ID, that all those things can identify you as an individual. And then there's further data that relates to your religion, your sexuality, all of that kind of thing. Obviously, that generally doesn't come through with payroll, but there are things to bear in mind. So the important thing is you want to rely on whoever you're giving that data to, that's going to be looked after. Also, you're looking at freeing up your key staff. So payroll can now, with all the rules and regulations, all the additional work that comes with operating payroll, can take away your key staff from doing what you really want to make use of them doing with regards to other roles, other areas that they can assist the business in. The legislative changes, obviously, whoever's looking after your payroll, you want them to be up to date. There is significant amount of legislative changes that come out, almost, and at the moment it feels like almost a daily basis. So certainly you would want somebody to be proactive in that, ensuring that all the staff you deal with are actually qualified to be able to operate your payroll. Now, I just wanted to introduce you briefly to who we are here. We operate, whilst we're based in Lincoln, we cover the whole country. We have a generic email address that goes to everyone in the team. We have direct line numbers, which are manned from 8 o'clock in the morning. Generally to 5:15, but quite often you'll get somebody a lot later. There's myself. I've got a mobile that you can contact me on or leave a message on if you need me. I've got 2 assistant managers, a senior payroll assistant, and a number of other assistants as well. And each one will look after your payroll as an individual payroll, as a company. What we do is try and personalize it so it works for you. Again, if you want any further information on that, please let me know. James, I think that's it from me. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. And the problem with this digital world is it's not as instant as a real world, is it? But thank you for your update, and you've covered a lot of ground there. And as you say, if there are specifics afterwards that people have to want to raise with you, your contact details are there. I think there's an awful lot going on in terms of employing people at the moment. So thank you. Now it gives me pleasure to welcome Anita Wynne, who's from Best Start HR, to provide her thoughts on what a post-pandemic roadmap for returning to work and managing the workforce will be like. An interesting topic, I'm sure, affects many of us. So welcome, Anita.
Thank you, James. Good morning to everyone. It's a pity we can't see you all, but I know you're there, so it's lovely to be with you again this year. Now, probably the most overused but accurate comment of 2020-2021 is unprecedented change. COVID-19 itself, but probably more importantly, the government's measures to address the virus has forced a huge amount of unprecedented change on all of us, irrespective of where we work or what we do. Now, some of these changes have been incredibly difficult for us. However, others have had a real positive impact. I mean, who could have imagined so many individuals adopting Zoom and FaceTime, irrespective of their age or technological capability? Now, the government has set out its own roadmap back to normality, and that means it's an excellent time for all business owners to review their own business and to set up their own business roadmap for the future. Now, that roadmap doesn't have to be a map back to where we were before, but neither does it have to make normal all the changes that we've had to adopt over the last year or so. This is a really excellent opportunity for all employers to reset and embrace the positive changes whilst also reverting back to things that maybe worked better previously. Now, this review should consider a whole range of different areas, and unfortunately I'm not going to have time to cover them all in loads of detail today. So some I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, and others I'm going to whiz through as quickly as I possibly can. Now, I'm really conscious that it's likely that many of you are going to have some really specific questions based on your own work environment. And normally I'd love to say, come and have a chat over coffee or those wonderful lunches that we got used to. And we're not going to be able to do that today. So feel free to pop the questions in the chat and we'll have some time at the end. Or in the last slide, it has my email address, and I'd be more than happy to have set up a chat for you to talk more specifically about your own challenges. Now, before we start, I want to just spend a few minutes clarifying the government's advice about opening up workplaces, because there was a little bit of room for interpretation around some of these. Now, first of all, I just need to say that the government's roadmap is dependent on the country continuing to make progress in terms of reducing infections, reducing deaths, and increasing those vaccination numbers. However, at the moment, the opening dates are around 3 specific dates: the 12th of April, that's next Monday, 17th of May, and the 21st of June. And your opening up date will depend on what type of business activity you are and what type of workplace you are. Now, irrespective though of when you open up, or if you have been operating all the way through, which I know a lot of workplaces have been able to do, you will need to make sure that you are COVID secure. And that's the government's title for the health and safety requirements that you need to put in place depending on what your workplace means. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about that later on, but there is some very specific guidance. It's actually excellent guidance available for different types of workplace on gov.uk. Now, for offices, the guidance remains at the moment that where an individual can work from home, then they should. And that actually technically remains in place till the 21st of June. And so many organisations are not thinking about opening up office space until after that date. Now, I would say, however, that the stay-at-home requirement has now gone. And last year, after post-lockdown 1, we saw that if you can work from home definition broadened slightly, not necessarily officially, but in terms of the way in which it was interpreted. So if you can work from home was broadened to if you can work home successfully and productively. And as a result of that, what we have seen is more and more companies over the last few weeks encouraging staff to come back into their normal workplaces starting from April the 12th. And this morning, ASOS announced there was lots of news in the story about them opening up their workplace and encouraging people to go back to work. Now, we're going to talk about some of those steps a little bit later, but this should give you some guidance of when you could be looking at opening up your workplace. So we want to start at the beginning. The best place to start is to review your business or your business model itself. Now, many organisations have been forced to be really creative in order to allow them to survive the last year. And whether that was doing something completely different or whether that was about the way in which things were done. So, for example, seated restaurants and pubs have moved into takeaways. Independent shops, I love to say my local charity shop has been offering virtual shopping where you're able to give them a call and then with Zoom them take you round the charity shop. And of course, we've also seen the education moving online as well. So other businesses may have also had to shrink down or have had to specialise or narrow in the type of things they've done. So as we start to open up our businesses and other businesses start to open up as well and the economy starts to expand, we need to consider whether or not we can or want to revert back to our original business or our original business model, or whether we want to continue to operate as we've learned to do, or whether we want to do a hybrid and the best of both. Now, many businesses were forced into these changes. Something was better than nothing. However, now is the time to really make sure that anything that has been introduced is effective, is efficient, and most importantly, is profitable and has sufficient margins, because it's only worthwhile doing if a business is commercially viable. So now is a really good time to have a look at what is commercially viable for your own business. And it's a really interesting point to start with, as it's going to have an impact on the roles and types and numbers of employees that you're going to need going forward. Now, following a business review, the next step is to think about how this impacts on the roles and numbers of employees that you're actually going to need. Changes made to the business model may impact on the detail of the tasks and the responsibilities that you may need some employees to do. Now, some individuals may have been doing this temporarily. If we think about our takeaways, our pub takeaways, many individuals who were maybe previously bartenders have been out delivering takeaways. So their roles and responsibilities have changed drastically, and they've accepted that temporarily. However, we cannot treat that as a permanent change to their job title, or their job tasks. And if we wish now for someone to continue to do those changes on a permanent basis going forward, then we're going to need to follow some form of formal process. And that formal process will depend on the size of the changes that are needed. So if these are really minor changes to someone's job, then you can discuss these with the individual, get their agreement, and then ask them to sign a new job description. Very simple. However, if they are more significant changes, which may impact what they do the majority of their time, for example, may impact their job title, most importantly, their seniority in the business, or maybe their career progression, then you're going to need to embark on a more formal process for them. And that's going to involve consultation and giving them notice of that particular change. Now, if they refuse those changes, which of course an employee has the ability to do, then you may need to rethink your tactic, and you may need to reposition the change as a redundancy, i.e. you are removing the old job that you once had and you're replacing it with an alternative role which is significantly different, and then you'll need to follow a different process altogether. Now, business model changes may also impact on the total number of staff that you need. It may mean the removal of some roles entirely. Some organisations who are going entirely to home-based working will no longer necessarily need receptionists or office managers, for example. Or we may also need a reduction in the number of people completing specific roles. Now, all of these come under the remit of a redundancy situation, and many of you may have already been through a number of redundancy rounds over the last year. But now is a good time to review, to reset, think about what you need going forward, and to make those final changes. I'm really opposed to what we call death by 1,000 cuts, lots of little redundancy processes all the time. Now is a really good time to get your workforce into the shape it needs to be to go forward. Now, I don't have time today to go through all the details of what you'll need to do in a redundancy process, but it will involve selection processes, placing people at risk of redundancy, consultation, and then issuing notice of redundancy. So if anyone is in this position, do give us a shout a little bit later. I'll be more than happy to talk you through what that process might look like for you. Now, Teresa, thankfully, has covered off the furlough scheme for me, so that's great. That's one less thing I have to cover off. But one thing I would say to you is that if you decide that you will need less staff or you have different roles, then you shouldn't be using the furlough scheme to postpone what is only going to be the inevitable. You really do need to start to think about that and action redundancies or changes now rather than waiting till the furlough scheme ends. One point of note, which Teresa didn't mention and is relevant to the point that I'm making now, is unlike the furlough scheme back in 2020, the furlough scheme we have now cannot be used to cover notice periods. And that's irrespective of whether an employee resigns or you make them redundant. You cannot have them on furlough and claim furlough payments during notice periods. And that's quite different from the redundancy processes we did back in 2020. So for organisations who have had some or all of their employees working at home, one of the most publicised successes of the pandemic has been the uptake and the success of home working. And I think it's true to say that many businesses prior to the pandemic were very reluctant to allow home working and really doubted whether it could work. Now, this area, though, continues to be a little bit of a changing picture. If we take our minds back to last summer, if you really want to think backwards, and we go back to June 2020 at the end of lockdown 1, many businesses, particularly large businesses in central towns such as Birmingham and London and Manchester and Liverpool, etc., announced that they weren't going to be returning to office-based working, and they were going to sell their expensive real estate, and everyone was going to work from home for the future. Now, however, as time has gone by and some individuals have been working from home now for over a year, some of the challenges of home-based working have certainly started to emerge. And now many of those really large organisations announced that are doing some incredible U-turns. So as with many of the changes that we have adopted, temporarily they've worked well, but in the longer term they may not be ideal. And either the changes then have to be adapted or we have to address those challenges that have come together. And some of those challenges are things like managing productivity, recruitment and inducting of new staff when there's nobody in the building, team cohesion and reduction in collaboration, people feeling really isolated, and also what is a suitable home working environment. Now, currently, having talked to lots of my clients, the preferred work environment appears to be working towards some form of hybrid model with a 2-3 or 3-2 model between office and home. Now, if you intend to consider either all home working for office-based staff or a hybrid model, a bit like we've talked about then, for some or all of your employees, then there is a range of considerations that you really need to think about prior to moving to this. I'm going to rattle through these quite quickly, but these are quite key. And these are some of the areas that we've been getting an awful lot of questions on over the last few weeks. So the first thing is to look at suitability for hybrid or home working. Up until now, we've had no choice. The government have said X and we've had to work and we've had to make it work. However, going forward, it is your choice as the employer to set some criteria of how you're going to assess whether A, a role, or B, more the incumbent's home setting is suitable for home or hybrid working. And that will look at a whole range of things, such as the size and space they've got available to work at home. Working at the kitchen table, working off the bed or on the sofa isn't going to work long term. So do they have the sort of space that is available in their home to enable them to work from home? Do they have the facilities? We've all seen the you're frozen, you're on mute, I can't hear you. Do they have the broadband speed? Do they have the mobile coverage that's going to allow them to do this? Also thinking about caring responsibilities. We've been incredibly flexible, rightly so, over the last year for when we've been having to accommodate with home learning. Will we carry on with that? Will people who have caring responsibilities, will we still be able to offer that same level of flexibility? So criteria as to whether a role and an incumbent are suitable for hybrid or home working is really important. And you have lots of questions there to answer. Also, the current working environment in your office may no longer be suitable or fit for the purpose, depending on where you go. We've had offices set up for people to come in and work 5 days a week all together in their teams. If we're going to move to home-based working, or if we're going to move to hybrid, then that setup may not be appropriate. And we might need to look at the amount of space we've got. We may need less space. We may need more meeting rooms or collaboration space as people come together to use the office for collaboration rather than for working. We might need less desks. We may need hot desks or lockers as people pop into the office in and out. So we also, as well as looking at the suitability of the environment at home, we need to look at the suitability of the environment in our workplace as well. And both of these, of course, have cost implications. As we've mentioned, one of the biggest documented challenges of home working has been the reduction in the opportunity for team cohesion, departments working together and also cross-departmental working, collaboration, creativity, brainstorming, all of those things have continue to prove a real challenge. And even big organizations like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, who are the real leaders in home working, are starting to backpedal on the impact that it's had on their ability to be agile and creative. So you're going to need to look at how you're going to create opportunities in the working environment or working practices to handle collaboration, creativity, and cohesiveness. A question we get asked all of the time when we start looking at where people are working is the responsibility for providing and also paying for equipment, desks, chairs, and technology, so laptops, computers, screens, mice, etc. And who is responsible for those if someone is working from home? And this has become a real issue when we start looking at hybrid working, where in effect you may be looking for two entirely complete setups, an office setup and also a home setup for the individual. So 2 desks, 2 chairs, 2 sets of screens, etc. Now, employees do need to have appropriate equipment to allow them to work from home from a health and safety perspective, and we'll come on to that at the moment. However, in law at the moment, there is no obligation for the employer to pay for it. Now, I would suggest that if an employer is going to move entirely to home-based working, then I would expect it's reasonable for them to provide the same sort of equipment as they would do in the office to home. But how they're going to deal with it in terms of a hybrid situation is a big question that you need to answer. And there is no definitive in the law. There's lots of options to consider. So employees providing it themselves as part and parcel of that suitability criteria, employers paying for all or some equipment, maybe a cash allowance that will cover a certain level of equipment that individuals can provide. But these are important considerations and things that need to be thought up quite early on in the conversation. Health and safety for me is an issue waiting to happen. Many employers have been treating the current home working scenario as a temporary basis and haven't really been covering their health and safety responsibilities. Employers are responsible for their employees' health and safety whilst working wherever they are working, including at home. And I can see that we may see quite an increase in repetitive strain injuries, back problems, where people have been working in inappropriate settings, like on their bed and on the sofa and at the kitchen table. And so it is really important, if we're going to move to permanent hybrid or some form of home working, that health and safety is dealt with properly. And there are various ways that we can deal with that. And we need to look at both display screen equipment, health and safety, but also lone working. And it's a big area that you really need to spend some time thinking about. I thought I wouldn't get away with a streets presentation without using some acronym, so I thought I'd throw GDPR in there as well. So I've talked long and hard about GDPR in previous years, and thank goodness I haven't had to do a half-hour presentation on it today, but it does have a feature in home working. Of course, when you're in the office, an organisation has an ability to control document and information security and confidentiality. When individuals are working from home all of the time or part of the time, that level of control starts to reduce. You have a lot less control over who can see what, who can hear what, all these Zoom calls, who can access what, and also what people are doing with maybe printed documents after they finish with them, so confidential waste. And all of these things need to be thought through, and either policies and procedures from a GDPR perspective changed, or measures put in place to ensure that there is confidential and security for relevant information. So as you can see, there's lots of things to think about in terms of the working environment. And it isn't just a case of employers being able to say, okay, well, we'll just carry on as we have been. Working hours. Now, under the law, all employees for many, many years now have had the right to request flexible working. Now, this covers both hours, working hours in terms of amount and the structure, but also location. So it covers the home working bit we've talked about earlier. Now, please note, and it's something that I keep telling employers whenever we're talking to them, this is a right to request. It is not a right to demand. Employees cannot demand that they work from home. They have a right to request it. And as you're an employer, you must then go through a standard process that's outlined in law, where you review the request, which you can then accept, suggest alternatives, or reject based on a set number of business reasons. Now, the reasons for rejection may now become a little bit harder as employees can point to the last year to show that things can work, and they can work. However, they have worked temporarily, and many employers have had to have had to accept things that they wouldn't normally accept because we've had no choice. But now, if we're looking forward permanently, it's a different matter, and you are able to reject if you feel that the working scenario isn't perfect. It hasn't created the right levels of productivity, hasn't created the right levels of efficiency, hasn't created the right levels of collaboration and cohesion. Now, obviously, you're going to have to think very clearly about how you reject those, but don't fear rejecting them. It is possible still. Now, this period, though, has illustrated that we do not need all employees to work core hours either. We can offer some flexibility to do work at different times throughout the day. And actually, if we focus less on hours and more on output, individuals can be a lot more productive. Now, this won't apply to all roles, and that's important for you to consider. We can't have a shop assistant working when a shop isn't open. However, on the other hand, if they're working on online orders, does it matter so much whether they're working 9 to 5 when the shop is open? So flexible working brings many, many benefits, especially for those individuals with caring responsibilities. It also brings benefits for employers. It opens up different recruitment markets that they may not have had before. But there is also a danger of work-life balances becoming blurred and individuals working excessively long hours because they have no reason to stop either. So you really need to consider the working hour patterns, maybe having core working hours with flexibility either side. But any changes that you're thinking of making, even if you've been adopting these temporarily, you will need to make them permanent through contract changes. The last year for many organisations has had a real impact on the organisation's culture and employee engagement. I think it's obvious to say if individuals have been furloughed for months and months on end, and many individuals may have been furloughed for over a year now, they're unlikely to feel part of your organisation or part of the team they work for. And particularly if they didn't have many years service prior to lockdown, they're really not going to feel part of you. In many of my clients, I've seen a real them and us divide developing, a real mentality of those who worked versus those who've been on furloughed, neither really appreciating the difficulties that both parties faced. And even if you have been operating, if you've got some of your team working on site and some of your team being able to work from home, then the culture and cohesiveness is likely to have been really impacted. Not seeing everyone every day affects our general appreciation of other people's workloads and other people's challenges. And also that lack of social interaction over the water cooler or in the kitchen or in the car park really creates distance and unfamiliarity where there wasn't some before. So depending on where your business is moving from and to, you really need to think about what you can do to reset that culture, get engagement from employees, whether that's company-wide or department-wide, and create some real opportunities for cohesion and collaboration that you may not have had to do before, but now are going to be relatively forced. Wellbeing is a really large issue, and we don't have a huge amount of time to talk about it today, but it is something that all organisations should be considered. This is a well-publicised side effect of the pandemic and the impact of lockdown and other government measures is on people's mental health. These are just some of the statistics that have been published, and many of these were pre-COVID levels, so I anticipate that when the statistics for last year are released, we're going to see much higher levels of stress and mental health. Stress and other mental health conditions are your responsibility as the employer under health and safety guidance. We also have a social responsibility. And of course, as you can see from here, prolonged absence due to stress can be really costly for any employer. So as part of your roadmap, we really need to think as an employer about whether do we actually have a problem, or even if we don't, what could we do to prevent any problems in the future? Now, stress and other mental health issues are caused by an imbalance in the demands that are placed on an individual, to the control that they have to meet those demands, and the support. So the perfect place to be is where an individual has demands are managed, they have some control over those demands, and they receive support from other people. And when that happens, stress doesn't become overwhelming, it becomes copable. It's good stress that we can deal with. Now, as an employer, you can impact on all of those areas. You can impact on the work demands. You can't always impact on the social demands and the demands placed about home and family and finance, but you can impact on the work demands that are placed on people. You can also impact on the amount of control an individual has in their life in order to meet those demands. You can have an impact on the control they have to meet the personal demands in their life as well. And you can also provide them with support. And some of the support that has been really successful over the last year is things about helping people to build resilience, to understand stress and demands and control, to help them to put boundaries in on their work life and routines and structures, but also to review the benefits that you provide. Some of the traditional benefits may become less important, and others, like employee assistance programs, may become increasingly important. Now, with only 5 minutes to go, we really need to talk about the next steps. I appreciate it's been a real rattle through of some of the things you need to talk about. And as I said, I'm more than happy to have individual conversations with businesses. But the first step is to do that business review. Identify the big overarching things about the business model, the roles it needs, and the numbers it needs, and to do that first. While you're doing that, it's a really good idea to canvass opinion from your employees. Use a survey, it could be anonymous or not, to get their views and opinions on how things have worked for them over the period of time. Things, positive changes that have really worked for them, but also some of the things that they found difficult and challenging. And get some buy-in for some of the things that you might be thinking of putting into place. So asking for people's views and opinions and thoughts and concerns and worries is a really good opportunity at that time. If you're a very small organisation, you might be able to do that in focus groups, but people generally feel more comfortable doing it in some form of survey. Whatever you decide to do, whether it's purely about just bringing people back and carry on as normal was back pre-COVID levels, or you're going to go through any of the changes we've talked about, you really need to communicate. You need to make sure you're communicating all along on both a group level, so the whole company level, but also then either individually or where people from a group level have identified particular concerns, particular individuals, then channeling that communication down individually to address people's individual concerns. We've seen lots of times when people have been working away from the office for large periods of time, even though the government is now saying it's safe to come back and you're really COVID secure, they'll feel really insecure about coming back. Some of those are social anxieties, but some of them will be around their safety and their health as well. And you need, from a legal perspective, to be seen to be addressing those individually before taking any other more affirmative action. You're going to need to review and then issue possibly changes to contracts, changes to handbook, changes to any general policies and processes that will reflect your new reality. So any form of working from home, hybrid, will all need changing to a whole raft of different contractual terms, policies and procedures, both HR related ones and general ones such as expenses and things like that, for example. And health and safety is a big issue. So if we're just opening up as normal, you must make sure you've got your COVID secure guidance in place. So you'll need to do a COVID secure risk assessment. You must share that risk assessment with all employees. You must identify anybody that may have very specific and individual risks, and they may need their own COVID secure risk assessment and guidelines. By nature, risk assessments tend to be really wordy and complex and long documents. So it might be a really good idea on top of that to also provide much more detailed but specific requirements and reminders to staff around washing hands and social distancing and all of those things as well. But getting yourself COVID secure, communicating that and then practicing that is going to be really important for anybody that's opening up their businesses over the next few months. If you're then also going to be looking at hybrid working or office-based working, then you're also going to need to look at home-based risk assessments for display screen equipment, and also loan working as well. So there's quite a large piece of work to do on health and safety as well as those things. So lots of things for you to be getting on with, lots of things for you to do. If you are waiting to June the 21st to open up things, although that sounds like an awful long way out, there's an awful lot to be done in the next 2 to 3 months, and I would really recommend you start working on this and start looking at this now so that it doesn't seem a rush. This is your chance to take control. If you don't take control of these things, I absolutely guarantee your employees will be knocking on your door, sending you emails or picking up the phone and going, "Oi, can I carry on working from home?" And it's a really good opportunity now for you to take control and set the scene and do what you need to do for your business to make it work successfully in the future. So look at that, 11:59, that wasn't bad. James, are we on? He's coming on. I don't appear to have any questions in the chat function at the moment. If anybody wants to put any questions up there, I'd be more than happy to ask. But as I've said, I'm going to flick to the last screen there. That has our telephone number on. We are back in the office, so please feel free to give that number a call. That's also our generic email address, and I'd be more than happy to take questions individually if people have very specific questions relating to their work.
Thank you, Anita, and for your impeccable timing. That's exceptional. I'm conscious that a lot of people now, at 12 o'clock, they'll move on to another Zoom or Teams meeting. So if people have got questions and want to stay around for a quick 5 minutes afterwards, that they're most welcome. Can I remind people the presentations are in the download at the right-hand side at the top where there's a tab called handouts. You will receive an email with the link as well if you're not able to download that. Can I thank both Anita and Teresa for their presentations, some useful topical updates and guidance, and a roadmap for a roadmap. I think there's some really practical things we can do there. And just to remind you that our next presentation will be our Finance Leaders Update on the 22nd of April. Again, details in the download. For further information on that or anything else from Streets, please do visit our website, www.streetsweb.co.uk, or email info@streetsweb.co.uk. Finally, may I thank you for joining us for this session, this presentation, and wish you a productive and hopefully enjoyable rest of the day. But as I say, the presenters and myself will be around for the next 5 minutes or so if you have got questions you'd like to ask. Thank you.
James, I can see one question that's just come up from Claire. So if I can dive in there and I'll answer Claire's question, which is probably one that many individuals might have. So we've moved to home working for many people permanently as we've grown so much we don't have enough space to return. Well, that's fabulous news. It's great to hear success stories out of COVID. Do we have to reissue employment contracts for those people? Claire, you don't have to issue a full employment contract for those individuals, but you will need to make changes to their terms and conditions. And therefore, it may be a good opportunity to issue them with a brand new contract if there's been updates over the last few years. So the sorts of things that you're going to need to consider is you need to change their place of work to their home address if they're now permanent home workers. That will have expense implications. So that does mean that if they then come to the office or you ask them to come to the office, they may be able to claim business expenses in terms of that travel. They may also be entitled to HMRC home working allowances, so you may want to put that into the contract as well. You will also probably need a working from home policy, which will cover things like health and safety, broadband requirements. Some individuals' mortgages or leases has clauses that prevent home working, so you would want to see to make sure that we haven't got that. You'll need to make sure that they've got relevant home insurance. And you'll also need to make sure that there's some guidance and outlines about the way in which they'll work at home to make sure that they remain safe. So all of those changes will need to happen. They're not all contractual. Some of them would be better served in a policy, but those are all things that you really need to do if you've changed anyone to permanent home working.
Thank you.
I don't think there's anyone else. Oh, there we go. Claire's listening. That's good.
Just out of curiosity then, Anita, whilst we wait for people either to ask questions or to download the presentations, are you finding a lot of businesses now are putting plans in place then? And there seems to be a much more stable or much more structure given to the lockdown 3 and the management of the business. It seems to be provide more certainty. This irreversible easing of lockdown and return to business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for those who we have worked with clients who have gone back to normal months ago, and so this has been a phased impact, but the vast majority of our other clients who have remained in some form of change, whether that's furlough, working from it, all are engaging at the moment around this roadmap and getting people back to work again. And what we're trying to encourage people to do is to just not just stick with what they've been doing or not just go back to normal, but to really try and get what the best of both practices are. And it does mean a bit of work, and it does mean a bit of strategic thinking, but for those who've done that, they seem to be really reaping the reward. So yeah, there's a lot of engagement about it this time.
I suppose the other question I've got is around the skills that people need. Are you seeing businesses creating new vacancies for new levels of skills? Things like chief technical officers seem to be highly in demand.
I think it depends on the type of businesses. We're seeing it at two ends. We are seeing more people having to consider the technical skills required for certain jobs and certain areas. And as a result of that, we're seeing a number of individuals, and I hate to use this term because it doesn't exist, retiring. But we don't have retirement in employment anymore, but just leaving because they've accepted the fact that things have changed so much, and they just don't want to continue to adapt in that way. So for example, online teaching. People who were still very comfortable with teaching in a classroom, but now online teaching or online training, they're just not comfortable in that sort of environment, and had hoped and hung on dearly that they would go back to the classroom. But the likelihood is that most training providers or colleges, etc., are using some sort of hybrid model. They're accepting that their time for hanging up their blackboard chalk and rubber is come to it. So we're seeing it at that end. We are seeing at the other end people embracing technology a lot more, and therefore needing individuals who have got technical expertise in order to advise.
Do you have to provide a laptop or a phone and for home working due to GDPR and data protection? That's a good question.
It is a very good question. So we've got two pieces of legislation here running alongside them, and of course with employment law ne'er the twain will meet. So from a health and safety perspective, as in providing, you don't have to provide company equipment like laptops and mobile phones for home working. You could ask the individual to provide their own. However, if you are working with sensitive data or even confidential data under GDPR, you have a lot less control over that data if somebody is using their own laptop and mobile phone. Now, it depends on how the technology is set up. So if you're working in an environment where you're on Microsoft 365, you're using SharePoint, and you're using all of the Microsoft tools, then actually the laptop is purely a vehicle in order for you to access that information, and there is no requirement for an individual to store that on their laptop at home. But you need to make sure they're not doing that, and you need to have all the policies and procedures and guidelines around it so that they don't do it. So you can still meet GDPR requirements and data protection requirements whilst an individual is using their laptop at home. But if you're not that sophisticated and you're not using those things, then it does pose real questions about ownership of data, security of data if someone's using their own laptop.
As we move to nearly 12, and on a virtual event, I do miss that chocolate brownie we normally get at one of our presentations, or the hot buffet that we've had in the past. So,
I was going to say the lunch.
You've provided food for thought, and thought for food now turns to food. But we're probably all making our own or make do, isn't it? But can I thank you both again for presenting, and thank everybody for joining us? And I think we'll conclude the session. So thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye.